The studio was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Millions tuned in from their homes, eager to hear from the legendary Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice had narrated some of the most profound stories ever told. At 86, he was as sharp, wise, and respected as ever. The audience erupted in applause as he walked onto the stage, his deep, familiar voice greeting them with warmth. Some in the crowd wiped away tears, overwhelmed by his presence. But something felt off. Vanessa, the host, was notorious for her ruthless, almost predatory interview style. Unlike previous interviews Freeman had done, this one had an undercurrent of hostility. She leaned forward, smirking. "Morgan," she began, her voice smooth yet cutting, "at your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The room fell into dead silence, the smiles disappeared, the warmth evaporated. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another in disbelief. Morgan Freeman didn't flinch. He simply clasped his hands together, his wise eyes locking onto Vanessa's. A storm was brewing, but she had no idea what she had just set in motion. Vanessa let out a chuckle, as if her words were harmless. But Freeman knew better. He had spent decades in Hollywood. He had seen arrogance, cruelty, and blatant disrespect before, but this was something else. She wasn't just attacking him. She was belittling every elderly person watching at home, every individual who had been told they were past their prime, that they no longer mattered. Freeman took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and leaned forward. His voice, calm but powerful, cut through the tension like a knife. "Miss Clark," he said, "have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" Vanessa blinked. She hadn't expected this. "Well, she stammered, but Freeman didn't let her finish. "I have, many times." His voice carried the weight of countless memories. "And do you know what they regret the most?" The audience was on edge. The world was listening. And they don't wish for more money or more fame. They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, and cherished life more. Vanessa swallowed hard. She had lost control of the conversation, and for the first time in her career, she was speechless. Vanessa's confidence wavered, but she refused to back down. The silence in the studio was deafening, the weight of Morgan Freeman's words still lingering in the air. The audience sat motionless, holding their breath. Some clutched their hands together, others blinked back tears. This was no longer just an interview. It had become something far more profound. Desperate to regain control, Vanessa forced a laugh, though it lacked its usual arrogance. "Well, Morgan, you sure know how to spin a tale," she said, trying to sound amused. But there was a crack in her voice, a hesitation. "But let's be honest," she pressed on. "Hollywood tends to forget about people your age, doesn't it?" Gasps rippled through the studio. The audience knew what she was trying to do, push him into bitterness, make him admit to feeling discarded. But Freeman, as always, was a step ahead. He leaned back in his chair, his deep, knowing eyes studying Vanessa. He rubbed his fingers together, a familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. Then, with a voice steady as ever, he spoke. "Let me tell you a story." The audience leaned in. When Morgan Freeman tells a story, you listen. "There was once a young man," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "He was full of dreams, full of life. He believed the world would always have a place for him. But time has a way of humbling us." Vanessa's smirk faded. One day that young man grew old, and he realized that the same world that once applauded him had moved on. They no longer saw him. They no longer listened. A woman in the front row wiped away a tear. A man clenched his fists, lost in thought. "But one night," Freeman continued, "he sat by his window and watched a storm roll in. And that's when it hit him." Vanessa swallowed hard. "What did he realize?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Freeman met her gaze. "That even when the sky turns dark, even when the world forgets the sun is still there, still burning, still shining, even behind the clouds." A hush fell over the room. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, crossing her legs, gripping her cue cards like a lifeline. But Freeman wasn't finished. "Irrelevance," he said softly, "is a label given by those too young to understand wisdom. But wisdom never fades." Vanessa parted her lips, but for the second time that night, she had no words. Vanessa sat frozen, gripping her cue cards as though they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The air in the studio was thick, electric with something unspoken. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words settled over the room like a heavy fog, undeniable and unshakable. The audience, once eager for their host's signature takedowns, had grown quiet. Some sat with their hands clasped. Others blinked back unexpected tears. Freeman hadn't just answered Vanessa's pointed question. He had dismantled it, reshaped it into something greater. Vanessa let out a forced chuckle, an attempt to break the spell. "Well, Morgan," she said, voice shaking despite her best efforts, "that was quite the speech. But let's talk about your past, shall we?" She glanced down at her notes, desperate to find her footing again. "You grew up poor. Your mother was a cleaner. Your father left when you were a boy. Do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even the most seasoned TV watchers felt it. Vanessa wasn't just pushing for a reaction, she was trying to rattle him. Morgan Freeman, however, didn't flinch. Instead, a small, knowing smile played at his lips. He exhaled softly, rubbing his fingers together, eyes locked onto Vanessa's with a quiet intensity. Then he spoke. "No, Vanessa," he said calmly. "I thank them." The host blinked. "What?" "My father taught me something important," Freeman continued, his voice deep and steady. "He showed me exactly the kind of man I didn't want to become." The audience leaned in. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "And my mother," he paused, his voice thick with emotion, "she taught me how to survive." A woman in the front row wiped away a tear. A man near the back swallowed hard, his expression unreadable. Freeman wasn't just recounting his past. He was transforming it into a lesson, one that Vanessa had never anticipated. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her confidence wavering. "So you don't regret anything?" she asked, though the certainty in her voice was gone. Freeman chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Regret is a weight I choose not to carry," he said. "I carry my past with me every single day, but never as a burden. I carry it as a reminder that I'm still here." A murmur spread through the crowd. A man in his 70s clenched his fists, lost in a memory. A young woman reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand. Freeman's words weren't just moving, they were personal. Vanessa swallowed, gripping her cue cards tighter. "But don't you ever feel bitter?" she pressed, her voice quieter now. Morgan Freeman smiled again, shaking his head. "No, Vanessa," he said simply, "because pain is a teacher. And it taught me well." The audience sat in stunned silence. Once again, Freeman had turned a question meant to corner him into something profound, something unforgettable. Vanessa stared at him, her usual bravado slipping away. She had thrown everything at him, age, irrelevance, hardship, and yet here he was, unshaken, untouchable. And for the first time in her career, Vanessa didn't know what to say next. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words still hung in the air. Vanessa sat motionless, her perfectly rehearsed confidence beginning to crack. She had spent years mastering the art of control, pressing, prodding, tearing down her guests with the sharpness of a blade. But now she was on the receiving end of something far more powerful. Freeman had flipped the conversation on its head. He had taken pain and turned it into wisdom, had turned her calculated jabs into moments of reflection. And for the first time in her career, Vanessa wasn't the one in control. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers tightening around her cue cards. She needed to recover, to regain the upper hand. With a forced smile, she glanced down at her notes, searching for a way to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. "All right, Morgan," she said, clearing her throat. enough about the past. Let's talk about the future." Morgan raised an eyebrow, waiting. Vanessa leaned forward, her tone carrying an edge of forced lightness. "You're 86 years old. You've had an incredible career. But time doesn't stop for anyone. Don't you ever feel afraid? I mean, do you ever wake up knowing that any day now could be your last?" A hush fell over the audience. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the crew behind the cameras exchanged uneasy glances. It was a question that no one dared to ask so bluntly. Morgan Freeman, however, simply smiled. He exhaled softly, folding his hands together before leaning in slightly. Then, in that legendary voice that had narrated the very essence of human experience, he spoke. "Vanessa," he said, his tone deep, warm, and unshaken, "do you know the difference between fear and faith?" The room was still. Vanessa blinked. "What?" Freeman continued, his voice unwavering. "Fear is believing in the worst that could happen. Faith is believing in the best." The audience let out a collective breath. Someone near the back wiped away a tear. A woman in the front row clutched her husband's hand. Vanessa's smirk faltered. She had spent her career reducing people to sound bites, to headlines. But this was something different. "Every morning," Freeman continued, "I wake up and I choose faith. That's how I live. That's how I've always lived." The words settled like a slow-moving tide, sinking deep into the minds of everyone present, and for the first time Vanessa had no comeback, no sharp remark. For the first time, Vanessa was truly speechless. Vanessa sat frozen, her fingers clutching the cue cards as if they were the last thing keeping her grounded. The silence in the studio was thick, so thick it felt like even the cameras had stopped recording. Morgan Freeman had just turned her question on its head, replacing fear with faith, reducing her cutting remarks to mere whispers against the wisdom of his voice. She forced a laugh, though it came out strained. "Well, Morgan," she said, shifting in her seat, "you sure know how to turn a phrase." Morgan chuckled softly, his expression kind but knowing. He had seen this before, the desperate grasp for control, the need to dominate a conversation. He had spent his life watching people like Vanessa mistake volume for power. Vanessa exhaled sharply and decided to push forward, clinging to the one thing she had left, her reputation as the hard-hitting interviewer who never backed down. "Let's change the subject," she said briskly, flipping through her notes. "Let's talk legacy." Morgan tilted his head slightly, intrigued. Vanessa leaned in, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "You've accomplished so much in your life, but when you're gone, what do you think people will remember about you?" A bold question, a direct question, one meant to regain control. But once again, she underestimated him. Morgan Freeman smiled, slow and knowing. He leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice. Not in weakness, but in command. The audience leaned in with him, hanging onto every syllable. "Ah, Vanessa," he said, shaking his head. "You're asking the wrong question." Vanessa blinked. "Excuse me?" Morgan's gaze never wavered. "It's not about what people will remember about me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The real question is, what will they remember about you?" A gasp rippled through the audience. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. The camera zoomed in, capturing her wide-eyed expression. This wasn't just a question, it was a reckoning. Morgan sat back, his presence still towering over the conversation. "Think about that, Vanessa." His voice was gentle yet unshakable. "Because that's the only legacy that truly matters." Vanessa, the woman who had built a career tearing others down, suddenly found herself completely exposed, and for the first time in her career, she had no words left to say. Vanessa sat frozen, the weight of Morgan Freeman's words pressing down on her like an unbearable truth. "What will they remember about you?" His question hung in the air, not just for her, but for everyone watching. For the first time in her career, Vanessa wasn't in control. The cameras, the lights, the carefully crafted questions, none of it mattered anymore. Her usual confidence wavered. The audience, once a passive crowd, now stared at her with expectation, waiting. But what were they waiting for? An answer? A defense? Or just a reaction? She opened her mouth, then shut it. There was no clever retort, no sarcastic remark that could undo what had just happened. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, the audience no longer seeing her as the one in charge, but as someone who had just been confronted with something real, something deeper than any interview she had ever conducted. Morgan, ever patient, simply watched her. There was no smugness in his expression, no triumph, just wisdom, just understanding. Vanessa swallowed hard, gripping her cue cards as if they could somehow ground her. She started, but the word felt hollow. She had built an empire on asking the tough questions, forcing others to face uncomfortable truths. But now, for the first time, someone had turned that mirror on her. And she didn't like what she saw. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The audience watched in stunned fascination. Even the crew, usually detached professionals, had paused. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "It's never too late, Vanessa." A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time, Vanessa wasn't just an interviewer. She was human, vulnerable, exposed. And in that moment, as the cameras rolled and millions watched, Vanessa, known for tearing others down, finally began to break. But this time, in the best way possible. Vanessa, the woman known for her razor-sharp questions and ruthless interviews, sat before the world, silent, exposed, and utterly unprepared for what had just unfolded. The power dynamic had shifted, and she could feel it. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still holding their breath, waiting. But waiting for what? Her voice, once a finely tuned weapon, failed her. Her mind, always sharp and calculating, was now a storm of doubt. Morgan Freeman had done what no one else ever could. He had stripped away the armor she had worn for years, forcing her to face the one question she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Who was Vanessa without the bravado? Morgan's deep, knowing eyes never left her. He wasn't here to humiliate her. No, this wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. An invitation to change, to step away from the hollow persona she had crafted and embrace something real. But was she ready? The audience could see it, the tremble in her fingers, the way her breath hitched. Something inside Vanessa was breaking. She let out a shaky laugh, an attempt to regain control. "You know, Morgan," she started, but her voice cracked. She swallowed, hard. "I wasn't expecting this." Morgan tilted his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in the smallest of smiles. "Neither was I," he admitted. "But sometimes, life gives us the conversations we need, not the ones we plan." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, heavy, warm, inescapable. She felt something shift deep within her, something terrifying yet oddly freeing. For the first time in her career, Vanessa wasn't just conducting an interview, she was living it. And for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The audience watched in awe. The cameras captured a moment no one would ever forget. Vanessa, the woman who had built a career on exposing others, had finally been exposed herself. And the question now was, what would she do next? Vanessa sat frozen in her chair, her usual poise shattered. The woman who had spent her career controlling conversations, bending them to her will, now found herself on the receiving end of a truth she had never dared to face. The studio was silent, the weight of Morgan Freeman's words pressing down on every soul in the room. And then, just when she thought she might regain her footing, Morgan leaned forward slightly, his deep, resonant voice filling the air like a slow-moving tide. "Vanessa, let me ask you this," he said, his tone gentle yet unwavering. What do you want them to remember about you? The question sliced through her like a blade. A murmur rippled through the audience. A few heads turned, whispering among themselves. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She looked down at the stack of cue cards in her hands. The same cards she had relied on for years to dictate the direction of every interview, but now they felt useless. For the first time in her life, Vanessa had no answer. Morgan didn't push. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. He simply let her sit in it, let the weight of the moment settle. The camera zoomed in, capturing her like never before, not as the ruthless journalist, not as the woman who always had the upper hand, but as someone vulnerable, someone real. She exhaled shakily, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's a good question, Morgan. Her voice wavered. She cleared her throat, trying to compose herself. I don't know. Morgan nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then maybe it's time to find out. The audience erupted, not in cheers, not in applause, but in a slow, emotional wave of understanding. Strangers in the crowd exchanged glances, some with tears in their eyes. They weren't just watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing something profound, something raw and transformative. And Vanessa, she felt it too. She had spent years tearing others apart with her words, and now, in just one night, Morgan Freeman had rebuilt her with his. The realization hit her all at once. She blinked, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then, for the first time, she did something she had never done before. She put down her cue cards, looked Morgan Freeman in the eye, and whispered, "Thank you." The cameras captured it, the world saw it. And just like that, Vanessa was no longer the same woman who had walked onto that stage. Lessons from Morgan Freeman's interview, Wisdom for Life. Morgan Freeman's powerful words in that interview remind us of something crucial. Life is not about control, but about understanding, growth, and purpose. Here are some key takeaways to apply in our daily lives. Choose wisdom over ego. Vanessa entered the interview with confidence, thinking she had the upper hand, but Morgan reminded her true strength is not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. In life, let go of arrogance and embrace wisdom. Listen more than you speak. Learn from those who have walked the path before you. Legacy is built in the present. Morgan's question, "What do you want them to remember about you?" is one we should all ask ourselves. Legacy is not something we leave behind. It's something we create every day. Every action, every word, every choice shapes how we are remembered. Live with intention. Be kind. Be impactful. Be someone worth remembering. Fear versus faith, your choice. Morgan spoke about the difference between fear and faith. Fear believes in the worst, while faith believes in the best. In life, challenges will come, but the way we face them defines us. Do not let fear dictate your path. Trust that every day is an opportunity to grow, to change, to start again. It's never too late to change. Vanessa realized that the way she lived, the way she treated others, could be different. No matter how much time has passed, change is always possible. Whether it's rebuilding relationships, finding purpose, or shifting perspective, you are never too old, too late, or too broken to start again. Live wisely, live with purpose, and most importantly, live in a way that when asked what people will remember about you, you already know the answer.